December 1914. The First World War had raged for barely 5 months, but already it had transformed Europe into a continent of despair. What had begun that summer as a series of bold declarations, patriotic parades, and promises of swift victory had devolved into a nightmare of mud, blood, and ruin. By the winter of that first year, more than 1 million men were dead or wounded. The optimism that once sent soldiers marching through cheering crowds was gone, replaced by exhaustion, fear, and disbelief. This was not the quick war they had imagined. It was a grinding machine that devoured men and offered nothing in return. Along the Western Front, from the Belgian coast to the Swiss frontier, 2 vast armies faced each other across a barren, shattered wasteland. The Germans on one side, the British and French on the other. Between them lay no man's land, a stretch of churned earth scarred by shell fire, littered with broken weapons, frozen bodies, and twisted barbed wire. In some sectors, the opposing trenches were less than 100 yards apart. The men on both sides lived like ghosts. They slept in mud, ate in mud, fought in mud. Rats the size of cats swarmed over the corpses of the fallen. Lice infested every seam of their uniforms. The smell of decay hung over everything, a mix of rotting flesh, unwashed bodies, and stagnant water. When the rain came, the trenches filled like ditches. Soldiers stood ankle-deep, sometimes waist-deep, in freezing, filthy water. Boots rotted on their feet. To step outside the trench was to risk a sniper's bullet. To stay inside was to slowly drown in the mire. Letters from home became lifelines. Mothers, wives, sweethearts, all tried to sound hopeful, though fear seeped through every line. "We pray for your safe return by Christmas," one might write, not realizing that thousands of soldiers on both sides had been told the same comforting lie. The war was supposed to be over by now. The Kaiser had promised victory by the holidays, so had the generals in London and Paris. But the reality was far different. By late December, the world's most powerful armies were locked in a stalemate. Each side dug deeper, building elaborate trench systems with dugouts, firing steps, sandbags, and barbed wire. Every few days an artillery barrage shattered the silence, followed by a brief bloody assault that gained a few yards of mud, only to lose it again. In the trenches, the soldiers' conversations turned from strategy to survival. They spoke of food, of warmth, of home. They sang old songs from their villages, shared cigarettes, and wrote letters that might never be sent. And as the days grew shorter and colder, another topic crept into their thoughts: Christmas. What would Christmas be like here, among the rats and the mud? Would there be any trace of it at all? For the German soldiers, the thought of Christmas carried deep meaning. In their homeland, it was a time of candles, church bells, carols, and family gatherings, the heart of their cultural tradition. Even in the trenches, they tried to hold on to those customs. They decorated small fir trees with candles and paper ornaments. Some units received Christmas packages from home: sausages, cigars, cookies, even bottles of wine or schnapps. The British soldiers, too, felt the pull of the holiday. Their mail brought tins of pudding, chocolate, and hand-knit scarves from mothers and sisters. The British government even sent each man a small brass box engraved with the image of Princess Mary, filled with tobacco and sweets, a token of appreciation from the royal family. But beneath these small comforts, morale was low. The soldiers on both sides were tired of killing, tired of seeing friends die for a few yards of ground, tired of the endless cold. They had begun to realize that this war was not about glory or honor, but survival. Still, on the eve of December the 24th, something remarkable began to happen. As darkness fell across the front, the bitter wind carried with it a sound that no one expected to hear: singing. Faint at first, then louder. It came from the German lines: "Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht, silent night, holy night." The melody drifted through the frozen air, across the no-man's land that had seen so much death. The British soldiers listened, at first in disbelief, then in silence. Some joined in softly, singing the English words. For the first time in months, the sound of guns was replaced by the sound of music. For a moment, war itself seemed to pause. No one could have known it then, but that night, December 24th, 1914, would become one of the most extraordinary nights in modern history. the night the guns fell silent, the night enemies became men again, the night peace returned, if only for a few fleeting hours, to a world consumed by war. The night of December the 24th, 1914. Across the frozen fields of Flanders, a strange and haunting calm settled over the front. The snow, which had fallen softly throughout the day, now glowed faintly in the moonlight. In places, it covered the bodies that had lain for weeks between the lines, transforming the battlefield into something that looked almost peaceful, though everyone knew what was buried beneath. The British soldiers of the Royal Scots and the London Rifle Brigade huddled in their trenches, breath steaming in the cold air when they heard it again, voices faint but clear, drifting from the German side. At first, they thought it might be a trick. The Germans had tried everything: feigned retreats, false signals, even shouts in English to lure men into the open. But this was different. The voices weren't shouting orders or insults, they were singing. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. The tune carried easily in the still night. The British troops listened. Some recognized the melody, Silent Night, one of the most cherished carols of their own Christmases. Before long, a few of them began to hum along, then to sing softly, their English words weaving through the German. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. On both sides, laughter and applause followed. One song became two, then three. Soon, men who had spent months trying to kill each other were singing together across the very ground that separated them. From one trench came the German version of O Tannenbaum. The British replied with the first Noel. When the carols faded, a voice called out, clear and confident with a thick accent, "You sing good, Tommy, come over here." The British soldiers laughed. One shouted back, "No fear, Fritz, you come to us." Then, silence again. For a moment, the soldiers on both sides stood listening, waiting, half expecting the gunfire to resume. But it didn't. Instead, small points of light began to appear along the German parapets. At first, the British thought it was the reflection of gunfire. Then they realized what they were seeing: candles, dozens of them. Some were stuck in the frozen mud, others were placed carefully in tiny fir trees that the Germans had received from home. The glow of the candles flickering through the mist gave the German lines a strangely magical appearance. One British soldier later wrote, "It was the most extraordinary sight I've ever seen. I shall never forget it. There were those Christmas trees along the enemy parapet, like lines of fairy lights, and not a shot was fired." Curiosity began to replace fear. Heads appeared cautiously above parapets. The officers, nervous about any sign of weakness, warned their men to stay alert. But the soldiers themselves, young men far from home, weary and cold, felt something different that night. They were done with killing, at least for this one evening. Some began to shout greetings. "Happy Christmas, Fritz! Happy Christmas, Tommy!" The replies came back instantly, laughter mixed with broken English and German. Then, slowly, a few brave souls decided to risk it all. From the German side, a soldier climbed out of his trench. He held his hands up high and walked into no man's land. The British aimed their rifles but didn't fire. They watched as the man stopped midway, waved and called out, "No shooting! You come too!" One by one, the British soldiers began to climb up as well. The officers tried to shout them back, but soon even they were too astonished to stop it. The unthinkable was happening. In the middle of one of the bloodiest wars in human history, men from opposing sides were meeting face to face, not as enemies, but as fellow human beings. The first soldiers met cautiously, hands raised, rifles slung behind their backs. Then came smiles, handshakes, pats on the shoulder. Cigarettes and cigars were exchanged. One British private offered a piece of plum pudding. A German soldier handed over a sausage. They laughed at each other's uniforms, tried to communicate through gestures and fragments of language, and soon realized that they weren't so different after all. A German officer, speaking perfect English, told his British counterpart that he had once worked in London, at a shipping office near the Thames. Another soldier pulled from his pocket a photograph of his wife and two children, showing it proudly to the men who, only hours before, had been aiming rifles at him. It was as though, for one miraculous night, the madness of war had been suspended. A private from the British side later wrote, "We shook hands, we wished each other a Merry Christmas, and we realized that we were all just men who were tired of killing and wanted to go home." As the night deepened, the singing resumed. Louder, richer, more joyous than before. Hundreds of voices, German and British together, rose into the cold air. Sleep in heavenly peace. In that moment, no one thought of politics, empires, or generals. They thought only of home, of the warm light of a hearth, the laughter of family, the taste of Christmas dinner. They were young, many no older than 20, and for one brief night they allowed themselves to be human again. No Man's Land, that haunted stretch of death and mud, became for a few hours a place of peace. But as dawn approached, none of them yet knew that the next day would bring something even more extraordinary. The dawn of Christmas Day 1914 broke cold and misty. The frost shimmered on the ground between the trenches, and a pale sunlight crept across the frozen fields of Flanders. For once there was silence. No artillery shells, no machine gun fire, no screams echoing through the smoke. The only sounds were the crunch of boots in snow, the soft murmur of voices, and from somewhere in the distance the faint notes of a harmonica. In many sectors of the Western Front, men who had spent months trying to kill one another now stood in the open, unarmed, smiling and shaking hands. The Christmas truce had truly begun. A day without war reports came from up and down the front, Germans, British, French and Belgians all leaving their lines. Some carried small flags or white cloths tied to sticks. Others came with gifts, tins of food, cigarettes, chocolate or bottles of beer. A British private named Alfred Anderson later recalled, "It was a short peace in a terrible war, but it was a peace all the same. I will never forget the sight of German and British soldiers laughing together in the middle of no man's land." In some places they spoke to each other in broken English or German. In others, gestures and laughter did the talking. The language barrier didn't matter. Humanity had found its own translation. One soldier described how a German offered him a cigar with a grin and said, "You smoke good English tobacco, yes?" The Brit replied, "Not as good as yours." And they both laughed like old friends. Exchanging gifts and mementos. The exchange of gifts became one of the most moving parts of the truce. The Germans, better supplied that winter, often handed out cigars, sausages and schnapps. The British shared their plum puddings, tins of bully beef and tea. Buttons, badges and caps were swapped as souvenirs, small tokens of a day that seemed impossible. Many soldiers even posed for photographs together, smiling arm in arm. Those photos, smuggled home later, would serve as proof that such a miracle had truly happened. Some British soldiers received postcards from their German counterparts, with notes saying, "When the war is over, let's be friends again." It was as if, for one fleeting day, the men were determined to reclaim their humanity from the machinery of war. Burying the dead. In the days before Christmas, the stretch of no man's land had been littered with bodies, soldiers who had fallen weeks earlier and lay unburied between the lines. Now, under the white flag of truce, men from both sides worked together to give them proper burials. They dug shallow graves in the frozen ground, wrapped the dead in blankets, and placed crosses made of wood above their resting places. Priests, British and German, recited prayers side by side. A German chaplain read from the Book of Psalms, while an English officer responded with the Lord's Prayer. One witness described the scene. It was a solemn moment. There were men there from both armies, their heads uncovered, standing in silence as prayers were said. I thought it a remarkable thing. Enemies standing together, honouring the dead. When the last body was buried, the soldiers shook hands once more. Some saluted, others bowed their heads. They knew that the peace would not last, but for that brief moment they shared a sense of respect, for the fallen, for each other, and for the fragile bond that had been formed. The football matches. Then came one of the most legendary moments of the Christmas truce, the football games. The details differ from story to story, but in several sectors, soldiers used makeshift balls, sometimes a leather football, sometimes a sandbag or a tin can, and began to play. Men from both sides laughed and cheered as they ran across the frozen mud, boots slipping, uniforms stained with dirt. Rifles were set aside. Helmets were used as goalposts. Private Ernie Williams of the London Rifle Brigade recalled, "We played between the trenches in the shell holes. There were no referees, no rules, just men kicking about a ball for the sheer joy of it. I think the Germans won 3-2, but no one cared about the score. Even officers who initially tried to stop the games found themselves watching in silence. some smiling, others shaking their heads in disbelief. For that single hour, the Great War, the war that was supposed to end all wars, paused completely. There were no sides, no nations, no commands, only laughter, the crunch of boots in snow, and the echoes of men rediscovering what it meant to be alive. Reflections and humanity. Throughout the day, conversations flowed. Soldiers shared where they came from: Hamburg, Manchester, Berlin, Glasgow. Some even realised they had lived in the same cities before the war, perhaps walked the same streets years earlier, never imagining they would meet again like this. Photographs were passed around. Someone played a violin, others joined in songs. Auld Lang Syne, Silent Night, O Tannenbaum. For a moment the front was transformed. A British lieutenant later wrote in his journal, "We spent the day with the enemy. We smoked together, ate together, sang together. If only those in power could have seen it. They would never again send men to die in this way." That night, as the sun set and darkness returned, the soldiers reluctantly began to withdraw to their own lines. The truce, as beautiful as it had been, could not last forever. But before they left, one German soldier raised his voice across the empty ground. "Tomorrow we shoot again, yes?" To which a British soldier called back, "Yes, but today Merry Christmas." Laughter followed, tinged with sadness. The Christmas Day truce of 1914 would never happen again on such a scale. As the war dragged on, orders from both sides forbade further fraternization. The generals feared that kindness might weaken discipline. But for those who were there, those who saw enemies turn into friends, if only for a day, it became one of the most unforgettable moments of their lives. They had seen with their own eyes what peace could look like, even in the midst of a nightmare. When dawn broke on December the 26th, 1914, the Western Front had changed once again. The laughter of Christmas Day had faded, replaced by the cold silence of the battlefield. The orders were clear and absolute: no fraternization with the enemy. Officers from both armies walked the lines, reminding their men that they were soldiers, not friends. The high command on each side, upon hearing reports of the truce, was furious. They feared that if soldiers saw their enemies as human beings, they might hesitate to fight. And yet, even as new orders came down from headquarters, many soldiers found it impossible to erase the memory of what had happened the day before. The return to war, by mid-morning, the uneasy peace began to unravel. In some sectors, the sound of rifles cracked through the air again, tentative at first, as if both sides were testing the silence. Then artillery thundered once more, shaking the frozen earth. The truce was over. A British private later wrote, "It was heartbreaking. Yesterday we were shaking hands, and today we were back to killing. I don't think anyone who was there truly wanted to shoot again. Some soldiers even tried to prolong the peace. They deliberately aimed high, firing into the air instead of at the enemy. Others refused to shoot altogether, earning harsh punishment from their superiors. But the machinery of war was relentless. Orders came from generals who were hundreds of miles away, men who hadn't seen the faces of the soldiers in no man's land. And so, the Great War rolled on. Commanders' outrage. The reaction among the military leadership was swift and unforgiving. British General Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien issued strict orders forbidding any repetition of the truce. He declared, "Friendly intercourse with the enemy, unofficial armistices, and the exchange of tobacco and other comforts, however tempting and occasionally amusing they may be, are absolutely prohibited." On the German side, officers were equally alarmed. Some commanders punished soldiers who had participated, viewing the fraternization as a betrayal of discipline. Others quietly ignored it, understanding that morale had been dangerously low and that the truce had, in some strange way, restored a bit of humanity to their men. But to the high command, the Christmas truce was seen as dangerous, proof that, given the chance, ordinary men might choose peace over obedience. Letters home, the secret witnesses. Despite the official condemnation, the soldiers who lived through that day carried its memory with pride. Many wrote letters home, describing the incredible events of Christmas 1914. A British soldier wrote to his mother, "It was the most wonderful thing imaginable. I met a German sergeant who used to work in London before the war. We shook hands and wished each other a Merry Christmas. I will never forget it." A German corporal wrote to his family in Cologne, "Yesterday we lived like brothers. We ate, we drank, and we buried our dead." It was a Christmas I will remember until I die. These letters, smuggled past censors, revealed a powerful truth that the men on the front lines had not forgotten their humanity, even when the world around them demanded hate. The legacy of the truce. In the years that followed, the Christmas Truce of 1914 became a symbol, a fleeting but unforgettable reminder of what was possible, even in the darkest times. Historians estimate that over 100,000 soldiers took part in truces along different sections of the front. Each one had its own story, some lasting only a few hours, others extending for several days. After 1914, such spontaneous truces became rare. The war grew more brutal, the weapons more devastating, and the leadership more determined to prevent any display of brotherhood. Gas attacks, heavy artillery, and endless offensives hardened the men's hearts. But those who had seen that first Christmas truce never forgot. Years later, when survivors gathered or wrote their memoirs, they spoke not of the battles or the victories, but of that single day when enemies met as men, and the guns fell silent. A flicker of hope. In history, in the decades that followed, artists, poets, and filmmakers would return to that moment, trying to capture its meaning. John McCutcheon's song Christmas in the Trenches and countless books and films would later tell the story to new generations. The image of soldiers playing football in no man's land became a timeless symbol, a reminder that peace, even for one day, could exist amid war. In 2014, on the 100th anniversary of the truce, commemorations were held across Europe. Descendants of soldiers from both sides gathered to remember what their ancestors had done. A new football match was played in Flanders fields, not to win, but to honour the memory of those who had dared to stop fighting, if only for a day. What the truce meant. The Christmas Truce of 1914 did not change the outcome of the war. It did not stop the killing that would continue for 4 more years. But it changed the way humanity remembers war. It showed that even in the most brutal conditions, when propaganda, fear, and hate ruled, compassion could still break through. It reminded the world that war is fought not by monsters, but by ordinary people, sons, fathers, brothers, who all long for the same things: warmth, safety, and peace. A British soldier later summed it up in his diary. It was as if we had all woken from a nightmare and seen, for just a moment, the truth, that we were all the same. That truth, fleeting but powerful, remains one of the most moving legacies of World War I. The Christmas Truce of 1914 remains one of the most remarkable moments in the history of warfare, a moment when men defied the madness surrounding them, if only briefly, to rediscover their shared humanity. It was not planned, not ordered, not coordinated by any government or general. It was spontaneous, born out of exhaustion, grief, and a longing for something that seemed impossible in that frozen hell: peace. For one day, perhaps only a few hours, men who had been trying to kill each other stopped. They talked, they sang, they laughed. They remembered that before the uniforms and orders they were human beings, sons, fathers, husbands, friends, what it revealed about war and humanity. In a way, the truce exposed a truth that frightened those in power, that ordinary soldiers, when left to their own conscience, might choose not to fight. It showed that the instinct for compassion is stronger than the instinct for hate, that even amidst the machinery of destruction, humanity refuses to disappear. The generals saw this as dangerous, but history saw it as miraculous. These men were not saints or heroes, they were weary soldiers, cold and homesick. And yet, in their weariness, they did something extraordinary. They proved that decency and empathy can survive even in the most inhuman circumstances. The men who remembered many of the men who took part in the truce never spoke of it publicly after the war. Some feared ridicule, others carried the memory quietly, as something sacred. But in letters, diaries, and memoirs discovered decades later, their words revealed how deeply the event had touched them. One British soldier wrote, "We were enemies that day only in name. The truce was not between armies, but between men." A German veteran, reflecting years later, said, "When I think of that Christmas, I cannot call them the enemy anymore. We were all fools in the same tragedy." Their memories defied propaganda. They reminded future generations that no war, however justified or patriotic, can erase the bonds of humanity that connect all people. The symbol that endures. Over a century later, the Christmas Truce continues to inspire. Monuments stand across Europe, simple wooden crosses marking the places where soldiers once shook hands. Every December, people lay wreaths, light candles, and sing carols like Silent Night in remembrance. Artists, historians, and teachers use the story to remind us of what war hides and what peace reveals. The truce has become more than a historical event. It has become a moral symbol, a reminder of what we are capable of when compassion triumphs over orders. It stands as proof that peace is not the absence of conflict. It is a choice made by individuals, even when the world around them chooses otherwise. A message across time. The men of 1914 are gone now. Their voices have faded, their letters yellowed with age. But their message remains timeless. In every era, people face division, fear, and anger, whether on battlefields, in politics, or in daily life. The Christmas Truce whispers to us across the decades. It doesn't have to be this way. If men, knee-deep in mud and surrounded by death, could look across no man's land and see brothers instead of enemies, then perhaps there is hope for the rest of us. It reminds us that empathy is not weakness, and compassion is not surrender. It is, in fact, the most courageous act of all. The final thought. As night fell again on December 26, 1914, the soldiers returned to their trenches. The war resumed, brutal and unrelenting. Millions more would die before the armistice came. But for those who had lived that Christmas, something had changed forever. They had seen a glimpse, however brief, of what peace could look like, and that memory would remain stronger than any order, any weapon, or any ideology. The Christmas Truce did not end the Great War, but it gave the world one of its most enduring reminders that even in the darkest of times, the light of humanity can never be fully extinguished.